The morning of March 18, 1943, began like any other training day at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley watched as his dive bomber students climbed into their SBD Dauntless, the same aircraft that had helped turn the tide at Midway just 9 months earlier. But something wasn't right. Over the past 6 weeks, Flatley had lost more pilots to training accidents than he had in actual combat during the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The pattern was both clear and terrifying. These weren't rookie mistakes or mechanical failures. Experienced pilots, men who'd already survived combat missions, were flying perfect dive-bombing runs straight into the ocean. Reports from other bases painted the same picture. At NAS Corpus Christi, NAS Pensacola, and other training fields across the country, dive bomber pilots were dying in ways that made no tactical sense. They'd roll inverted, pull into a precise 70-degree dive as doctrine required, track their targets flawlessly, and then simply fail to pull out. No radio distress calls, no signs of mechanical trouble, nothing. Their planes held the dive past the release point and safe pull-out altitude until recovery was impossible. Investigators found engines running perfectly, controls intact, and no sign of damage until impact. It was as if pilots had fallen asleep at the stick, but they hadn't. What was happening inside those cockpits was more insidious than fatigue. Since late 1942, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had received disturbing reports, but only now did the scale become undeniable. Official documents labeled the cause as failure to recover from dive, a phrase that hid a darker truth. The very dive-bombing technique that had won Midway was now killing the men who mastered it. The precision and discipline that made dive bombing so accurate had created a physiological trap beyond human limits. Flatterly compared notes with other officers, and a grim consensus emerged. It wasn't reckless or sloppy pilots dying, but the exact opposite, the most disciplined, the ones who followed procedure perfectly and held their dives to the very last second. They knew every 100 feet mattered, against moving ships. That precision could mean the difference between a hit and a wasted bomb. But the cost of that accuracy was fatal. Nobody had truly calculated what the human body endured when a 2-ton aircraft pulled out from a 70-degree dive at 300 mph. The math was simple, the biology was not. When pilots began recovery, the G-forces were immense, 5 to 7 times normal gravity, forcing blood from the brain to the legs in an instant. Vision dimmed, peripheral sight faded to grey, then narrowed to a tunnel, until total blackout followed at 5.5 Gs, and unconsciousness soon after. The timing was catastrophic. Pullouts lasted 4 to 6 seconds, but blackouts could begin in 2. Pilots often lost consciousness right when they needed control most. The stick went slack, the aircraft continued diving, and impact was inevitable. Sometimes consciousness returned just before the crash, giving the doomed pilot one final moment of awareness. Navy medical researchers replicated these G-forces in centrifuge tests at Pensacola, proving that pilots could delay blackout by tensing their muscles, a technique that worked in theory but failed in real combat. In the chaos of a real dive, no one had time to think about physiology. The Germans had faced this same crisis years earlier with their Ju-87 Stuka bombers. During Poland's 1939 campaign, they'd lost multiple aircraft to unexplained crashes, until engineer Hans Ulrich Rudd developed an ingenious fix, an automatic pull-out system. Before diving, the pilot set a recovery altitude on a barometric switch, and when the aircraft reached it, pneumatic actuators would automatically pull up, even if the pilot was unconscious. The system saved lives instantly, cutting fatal accidents by 80% and even improving bombing accuracy. Yet when American intelligence examined captured Stukas in 1941 THOF-2, they dismissed the device as needless German over-engineering. American doctrine insisted good pilots didn't need machines to save them, they just needed better training. That mindset would prove deadly. On March 22, 1943, during a routine training flight off Florida, Lieutenant Robert Chen of the USS Yorktown's Air Group 3, a combat veteran and expert pilot, never pulled out of his dive. His wingman, Ensign Marcus Webb, watched helplessly as Chen's Dauntless maintained its perfect attack angle until it struck the water in a near-vertical impact, leaving little to recover. Chen was the third pilot lost in 2 weeks. 5 days later, another would follow. The next days only deepened the alarm. On that same training exercise, Lieutenant William Stamper began his dive at 11:01 and never radioed a word. His aircraft simply held its trajectory. From the Yorktown's deck, observers watched through binoculars as Stamper's SBD maintained the prescribed dive through every altitude marker and then, with no pullout, slammed into the sea in a plume of white water visible for miles. Stamper had been Chen's instructor, a Coral Sea and Santa Cruz veteran with over 300 carrier landings, an aviator who could have flown that exercise in his sleep, and yet he died doing precisely the maneuver he'd taught 100 times. When the squadron returned to Yorktown that afternoon, the commanding officer grounded the entire dive bomber element pending investigation, and Admiral Mark Mitcher, who ran fast carrier operations, demanded the Bureau of Aeronautics stop treating these as isolated tragedies and recognize a systemic emergency. The inquiry that followed pooled data from every Navy and Marine dive bomber squadron in both oceans, and the totals were shocking. Between November 1942 and April 1943, the Navy lost 47 dive bomber pilots to pull-out failures in training alone, more than enemy action in the same span, and combat squadrons reported that 15 to 20% of pilots suffered at least partial blackout during operational dives, with several missions compromised when section leaders went unconscious, and wingmen had to abandon attacks to shepherd them home. An emergency panel at Anacostia brought together flight surgeons, designers, combat leaders, and pilots who'd survived blackouts. For 3 days in early April, they tore apart every assumption about dive bomb technique. Test pilots flew instrumented dives while medical monitors recorded heart rate, blood pressure, and oxygen levels. Chase plane cameras captured the exact frames when heads slumped or hands loosened on the stick. The evidence was irrefutable. The Navy's standard dive profile, taught everywhere, was physiologically unsustainable. The maneuver demanded timings and peak G-loads human bodies could not reliably survive, and doctrine had to change even though nobody on the panel could agree how to do it without destroying the accuracy that made dive bombing valuable. The solution, unexpectedly, came from a junior officer. Lieutenant J.G. Thomas Riley, a combat veteran from Enterprise, confessed he'd been violating doctrine in combat because the old rules felt wrong. Rather than initiating recovery at the prescribed 2,500 feet, and releasing early in the pullout, Riley held dives to 2,000 feet or lower, sometimes as low as 1,800, dropping his bomb from an almost vertical attitude, and then executing a gentler, longer pullout that spread G-forces over far more time. It broke every manual rule, and at Anacostia his claims were met with skepticism. A bureau commander insisted consistent accuracy below 2,000 feet was impossible because bombsight tables didn't account for such low releases. Riley, however, had gun camera footage. The panel watched and found his results contradicted doctrine. His circular error probable was roughly 35 feet, far better than the 65-foot CP considered excellent. Aerodynamicists then crunched the numbers and revealed why. Releasing earlier during a typical 2,500-foot pullout left significant horizontal velocity and complex parabolic trajectories, subject to wind, turbulence, and tiny timing errors. Small fractions of a second could translate into tens of feet of missed distance, whereas Riley's ultra-low releases from near-vertical attitudes produced almost straight-down trajectories with minimal horizontal component, negligible wind drift, and far less sensitivity to timing. Holding the dive longer and pulling out more gradually reduced peak Gs, around 4.5 G instead of spikes at 6 or 7, keeping pilots below blackout thresholds and allowing the cardiovascular system to compensate, while a slower onset let anti-G straining work rather than be overwhelmed. NACA wind tunnel work at Langley, applied to these ultra-low cases for the first time, confirmed the ballistic simplicity. A bomb released at 2,500 feet might travel roughly 180 feet horizontally before impact, gathering drift and turbulence along the way, but one released at 1,800 feet in a near-vertical drop would travel only some 40 feet, shortening flight time and sharply reducing error. Analysts then re-examined thousands of gun camera frames collected since Midway and found the correlation in the field. Pilots releasing below 2,000 feet, whether deliberately like Riley or inadvertently by holding too long, posted impact patterns about 40% tighter than those releasing at the doctrinal altitude, with the very lowest releases between roughly 1,600 and 900 feet, approaching an accuracy that had previously seemed unattainable. Previously, such precision had only been achieved through glide bombing attacks at much lower speeds. But the G-force distribution data told the rest of the story through accelerometers installed in test aircraft. Engineers meticulously mapped out the pull-out profiles initiated at varying altitudes, revealing that a pullout begun at 2,500 feet required the pilot to apply maximum back pressure on the stick immediately, as altitude was already running out and there was no margin for delay. This aggressive recovery generated a punishing 6 to 7 G spike, often causing blackouts. However, a pullout initiated at 1,800 feet could be performed more gradually, due to the steeper, more vertical attitude of the aircraft, allowing for a longer recovery arc. Instead of yanking the stick back, pilots could apply steady pressure and roll out of the dive smoothly, achieving the same altitude change with gentler forces. This kept peak loads below 5 Gs, within a range that allowed pilots to remain fully conscious and effective. Adjusting doctrine was one thing, retraining an entire combat aviation force to unlearn ingrained reflexes was another challenge entirely. In June 1943, under Commander Flatley's supervision, the Navy established an experimental dive bombing school at Naval Air Station Jacksonville, where the curriculum was rebuilt around the delayed pull-out technique, soon nicknamed riding the edge or the late pull. The first obstacle was psychological, convincing experienced pilots that descending closer to the water before recovery wasn't reckless, but actually safer. Training began with physics-heavy classroom sessions, where pilots studied G-induced loss of consciousness, blood flow charts, and graphs correlating G-onset rates with blackout probability. Flight surgeons explained how oxygen deprivation affected vision, making it clear this was not about bravery or skill, but biology. The best pilot in the world would still black out at 6 Gs if he pulled too hard, too fast. The goal was not to resist G-forces but to manage them, to spread them over time so the body could adapt. Then came instrument work. The new technique required immense trust in altimeters, especially when instinct screamed to pull out. Instructors used link trainers, primitive flight simulators, where pilots rehearsed dive profiles repeatedly, calling out altitudes aloud, passing 3,000, holding angle, 2,500, holding angle, 2,000 steady, 1,800, initiate pullout. These verbal cues kept their minds active, preventing tunnel vision and loss of altitude awareness, until the rhythm became instinctive. Actual flight practice began with unloaded dives, pulling out at 2,200 feet, just slightly below old doctrine, while instructors provided real-time altitude updates over the radio. Pilots learned to recognize visual cues that matched 1,800 feet, the target's size, horizon angle, and the sight picture that meant now. They mastered gradual pullouts with smooth back pressure, practiced anti-G straining before and through recovery, and learned to grunt forcefully, tightening their legs and core to trap blood in the upper body. By August 1943, Jacksonville was producing pilots who could consistently release bombs from 1,700 to 900 feet, achieving circular error probabilities under 40 feet, with 0 G-induced incidents. The program took 3 weeks longer than the old course but yielded irrefutable results. Accuracy improved by 35 to 50%, and training accidents nearly vanished. Pilots were still afraid. Diving to 1,800 feet demanded iron discipline, but they weren't dying anymore. The method worked, and now it had to spread fleet-wide before the next major operation. The delayed pull-out technique saw its first major test during Operation Forager, the invasion of the Marianas in June 1944. Task Force 58, with 15 fleet carriers, deployed dive bomber squadrons fully retrained under the new doctrine. On June 19, during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, dive bombers were redirected from ship attacks to intercept Japanese strike formations. It was a real combat test. Lieutenant Commander James Remage of Bombing Squadron 10 aboard the Enterprise led his unit from 12,000 feet, previously an impractical altitude for dive bombing. Using the delayed pullout, they held their dives through the Japanese formation, releasing below 2,000 feet at over 280 knots. The results were devastating. VB-10 destroyed or damaged 23 Japanese aircraft in one pass, with Ramage's own bomb striking a torpedo bomber dead-on, scattering debris over a quarter-mile. Not one pilot blacked out. Across the Marianas campaign, squadrons using delayed pullout achieved hit rates of 32% against maneuvering warships, compared to pre-1943 averages of 18–22%. During strikes on June 20th, bombs released below 2,000 feet accounted for 14 of 18 direct hits. The carrier Hayo was struck by 3 bombs from VB-2, all released between 1,500 and 1,850 feet. 2 even entered the same elevator shaft, sinking the ship within hours. Post-war analysis showed impacts clustered within a 50-foot circle, accuracy unthinkable 18 months earlier. Pilot survival also soared, G-induced blackouts dropped by 91%, and combat dive losses became statistically insignificant, fewer than 1 per 1,000 sorties versus 15 per 1,000 the year before. The blackout crisis was over, but more importantly, dive bombing itself had evolved. Pilots could now release with precision from ultra-low altitudes, allowing single planes to disable destroyers and two-plane teams to cripple cruisers. By Okinawa, in 1945, the delayed pullout was so ingrained that new pilots thought it had always been standard. They learned to ride their dives down to 1,800 feet from day one, viewing old high-altitude releases as clumsy and inaccurate relics. By war's end, dive bombers trained under the delayed pullout doctrine sank or damaged 47% more enemy ships per sortie than their predecessors, with lower loss rates and superior accuracy. What once seemed suicidal had become the foundation of modern precision attack. Those pilots who trusted physics over instinct, holding their dives a few seconds longer than every nerve screamed to, rewrote the rules of naval aviation. They learned to master fear, physics, and physiology, and changed aerial warfare forever by learning to pull out late. By the end of the Pacific War, the delayed pull-out technique had transformed dive bombing from a desperate art into a precise science. It wasn't just about flying lower, it was about understanding physics, mastering biology, and trusting instruments over instinct. The pilots who once feared the blackout now rode the edge with calm precision, proving that courage alone wasn't enough. Knowledge and discipline were what truly kept them alive. In just 2 years, the US Navy's dive bombers had evolved from blunt instruments of destruction into tools of surgical accuracy, striking targets with mathematical precision at altitudes that once spelled certain death. What began as a dangerous experiment in Jacksonville ended as a doctrine that reshaped naval air warfare forever. The men who learned to trust data over fear, who held their dives just a second longer than their instincts allowed, rewrote the very rules of aerial combat. Their courage, precision, and relentless pursuit of improvement didn't just win battles, they changed history. If you enjoy discovering forgotten innovations and hidden stories that changed World War II, make sure to like, subscribe, and share for more untold chapters of wartime history.